All right, well, joining us is former Marine Corps intelligence officer Scott Ritter. Thank you so much for joining us. A lot going on in Ukraine right now.
Well, thanks for having me. And yes, there is.
Yeah, so a major counteroffensive, a surprise attack from Ukraine in the Kharkiv region. And they've been able to gain back a pretty good, a sizable amount of land. I know a lot of people are now saying this is it. This is turning the tide. Ukraine is now finally on the offensive rather than the defensive. What do you think is, first of all, one question I think many of us have about this is what are the casualty counts at this point in this war? Because, I'm hearing from numerous sources, right, that on the Russian side, it's anywhere from 5,000 to 70,000. And on the Ukrainian side, it doesn't seem like we can get a clear number. Do you have those numbers just right off the bat?
I don't have anything official because neither side is publishing official statistics. But when you assess the totality of the battlefield over time and the intensity of the combat and the terrain on which it was fought, et cetera, I think we can say with relative certainty that prior to this offensive beginning, Ukraine's total casualty count was between 250 and 300,000, with about 80,000 of those being killed. The Russian casualties were probably between 15 and 20,000 dead and another 35 to 40,000 wounded. So between 50 and 60,000 casualties total. And one of the reasons why that's the case is the nature of the warfare that was going on. Most of these casualties took place once Russia transformed into its phase two operations. The grinding, the meat grinder, I call it, that took place in eastern Ukraine and as they liberated Lugansk and Donetsk from Ukrainians will say occupied. I'm trying to be impartial here. So as territory was acquired, the way the Russians sort of perfected a military algorithm, an approach that maximized Ukrainian casualties, minimized Russian losses, but it was also a very slow advance, just pounding away with 10-to-1 artillery superiority in terms of rounds fired. Your Russians are firing 60,000 rounds a day. The Ukrainians might respond with 6,000. That's just an unsustainable ratio of death and destruction. And so Russia was prevailing, grinding these guys down. But the Ukrainians were successful in withdrawing a significant number of combat experienced troops, replacing them with territorial reservists. And one of the reasons why the Ukrainian casualties are so high is that these guys who were holding the lines were untrained, being sacrificed. Basically, Ukraine sacrificed bodies to buy time to build up this 30,000 to 50,000 strong reserve that they used in this the most recent counterattack. So I think that answers the question on the casualties. Since the offensive came, just so it appears that the Ukrainians have suffered horrific casualties. I mean, they've been successful, and hats off to them. I mean, we can talk about that in a minute. There's no doubt about it that this is a Ukrainian victory. They beat the Russians in the north, in Kharkiv. They didn't beat them in the south. In the south, the Russians got, Russians were on the defensive, the Ukrainians were attacking, and the Russians probably killed around 4, 5, 6,000 Ukrainians with a whole bunch more wounded. It was a devastating defeat for the Ukrainians.
You're talking about down in Kherson, in that region?
In Kherson, yeah.
Yeah. So interestingly, this came up, actually, this has been popping around in the news. Ukrainian official claims Southern offensive was disinformation to distract Russia from the real offensive in Kharkiv. So they're saying that they did it to try to move those Russian troops to the southern region so that they could then do the surprise attack in the Kharkiv region.
Yeah, I mean, that's standard military, operational art. It's a diversionary attack, a fixing attack. So you come in with significant forces, you fix the Russians in place, and you cause them to divert reinforcements to deal with this. And when you're dealing with a Russian military that's only committed 200,000 troops on a very extensive, battlefront, once once you commit your reserves, and then the Ukrainians turn around and attack north, there wasn't much left to respond, and those that did respond had to go over, a long. It was a big haul to move from the south to the north. I have every reason to believe the Ukrainians on this one, that what happened in the south was a diversionary or fixing attack, and the main effort was in the north, where they exploited a very thinly held Russian front line, and it's stunning. The front line was held not by military forces, but by militarized police units, people without heavy
Right.
weaponry, by territorial militias that lack the body armor and the heavy weapons. And
Yeah, I read about this. So this wasn't the Russian military that was guarding this area. This was a police force. Can you explain that a little bit better?
sure, again, the Russians, they have a limited number of Army battalions, Marine battalions, airborne battalions committed to this fight. And a lot of them are involved in the offensive actions that are ongoing in Donetsk. There's a big battle in a town called Bakhmut, and then a lot of them are involved in the defense of Kherson, which is considered to be far more strategic because it protects the approach to Crimea. So in Kharkiv up north, the Russians seem to have thinned out their lines, and instead of putting these army forces there, they deployed these special police units. They're militarized police. They're very highly trained in counterterrorism, in taking down organized crime and things of this
So it's
nature.
like the SWAT team, is what you're saying.
It's
So
basically, you're 100% correct. As if they took the Los Angeles SWAT team and said, okay, we're now forming you into a provisional battalion and we're sending you to the front line. I mean, these guys are good. They know how to use weapons. They're disciplined. They're brave. They're not soldiers. Some of them might have military experience, but suddenly you've got the Ukrainians come out with a brigade's worth of armor, and it's like that's an unfair fight.
why do you think they did that? I mean, from what we're seeing is that they left behind a lot of artillery. So why wouldn't they put other people in charge of guarding that? It seems like they would have had at least some of their soldiers there to actually guard their weapons depots, but they left it in the hands of a SWAT team. I mean, why do you think they did that?
I think two things. One, I believe that the Russians became very complacent because of the successes they were having in the liberation or occupation of the Donbass and the fighting, where they were achieving 10-1, 15-1 kill ratios, which is unheard of in the attack, by the way. Normally, you're going to lose 3-4 guys for every one you kill. Here, they're killing 10 to 15 for every one guy they lose. And I think the Russians just got complacent. They believed that victory was inevitable. The other problem is what I'm calling this the modern day equivalent of the Israeli intelligence failure on the eve of the 1973 Yom Kippur War, where the Israelis failed to take seriously the threat of an Egyptian attack across the Suez Canal. Look, the online social media world was a buzz since May with the Ukrainian buildup of forces. They were even saying where the forces were located near Kharkiv and such. And so if social media, if the armchair generals are saying, hey, this is something that's about to happen, and they know the units, they know the disposition, they know everything, one would think that the Russians would know that too. But the problem is, I think the Russians suffered an intelligence failure that we're used to here in the United States, where maybe low-level analysts were accurately predicting the threat, but the threat that they were briefing to their bosses, where it was politically inconvenient. Because if you're telling your bosses are saying, hey, you got to make do with 200,000, we're not giving any more than that. And you're saying, hey, we're going to get attacked here. We need more troops. Boss doesn't want to hear we need more troops. And so middle management would water down the intelligence reports, downplay the threat, overplay the ability of the current force disposition. And then I think there was also operational sloppiness on the part of the Russians. If you're going to have these units screening the front line, which is what they're doing, you need to cover them with fire, and that fire needs to be responsive. What I mean is artillery needs to be dedicated right there. So when the guy picks up the radio and calls in the artillery against the advancing forces, they get blasted. It was taking the Russians more than an hour to respond. And I can tell you, a hostile tank can cover a lot of territory in an hour. So they were calling in for artillery support, and it wasn't coming. And the Ukrainians, I'll make another statement here. Prior to this offensive, Russia was fighting a Ukrainian army trained and equipped by NATO. This offensive was carried out by a NATO army manned by Ukrainians. It's a totally different approach. These guys came in with new tactics, new operational approach, better intelligence support, better electronic warfare support, better training, decisive actions on contact, things that the Ukrainians hadn't demonstrated before. This is a completely different military that the Russians weren't prepared to fight. And as a result, the Russians found themselves outclassed on the battlefield, and that prompted again, it wasn't a retreat. Everybody's saying, oh, the Russians retreated. It was a withdrawal. It was organized. It was disciplined. They had to abandon equipment. But the one thing that the Russians didn't do is lose a lot of guys. They killed a lot of the Ukrainians. They didn't lose a lot of guys. And at the end of the day, that's why ultimately this offensive may look good on paper, but it's not really going to change the calculus in the long term, because the Ukrainians basically burned through their reserves. It's going to take them 4 to 5 months to rebuild this kind of capability, whereas Russia maintained its most precious asset, which is its military manpower. So the Russians are going to be able to reorganize, re-equip, and respond quicker than the Ukrainians are in the future.
So regarding that, how many casualties were there from this actual offensive on the Ukrainian side? I have questions about this because there have been some videos that have been circulating around, and there's actually been some chatter on Telegram that these are unverified reports, but locals that are inside of these territories in the Kharkiv region are saying that the soldiers that they're seeing there now are not, they're not Ukrainians. They're saying that these are English-speaking soldiers. They're British, they're American, they're from other parts of the world, but they're not Ukrainian. I want to show you this video because this is kind of verifies a little bit of what these reports are saying, that these soldiers are English-speaking, that they're not Ukrainian. Here's this video.
Hey boys, where the fuck are we?
baby!
That's a lot of fighting if I can get here. Want to see what some Soviet shit looks like? If I flip this up. Look at that. Looks good. Welcome to Izium.
Okay, so this kind of, and people are pointing out that the uniforms of these soldiers are clean. Looks like they weren't necessarily the guys on the front lines. You're saying that there were a lot of Ukrainian casualties. I'm curious if, how many of these foreign fighters are actually there fighting on behalf of Ukraine? Are they putting the Ukrainians up there first as pawns, letting them sacrifice their lives while they then roll in and make TikTok videos? I mean, what is going on from your assessment on that?
My understanding is, it's probably a combination of the two. This International Legion has had a history of, fighting by TikTok and, to go out and do these propagandistic videos, et cetera. But again, this is why I'm saying something has happened. The International Legion that's there now has been turned into a sort of a commando force. It appears they've received training by both American and British special forces, and particularly the Special Air Service. One of the things they were doing is penetrating the Russian defenses with these, lightly armored columns full of men and machine guns, and just running rampant in the Russian rear at night, running up on a Russian command post or defended ammo depot, and just raking it with machine gun fire, guys dismounting, running forward, slaughtering as many Russians as they could, and then getting back in their vehicles and driving off and doing it again. That's real fighting. That's not fake fighting. They were also involved in several riverine assault operations, going across the river, establishing a beachhead initially so that the Ukrainians could follow through. So I think what we're seeing here is the International Legion in the last 3 to 4 months has been reorganized, re-equipped, remanned. They got rid of a lot of the war tourists that had been attracted initially to this fighting, and they've replaced them with international mercenaries. And that's what they are. These are people. The United States has been involved in what we call foreign internal defense operations, where special forces go around the world and train the militaries of a variety of nations in Africa, Asia, South America, and elsewhere. And we have a database of people whom we've trained, and the CIA maintains contact with them, and they use them for deniable activities around the world. And it appears to me that the United States has drawn upon this resource, brought in a number of these guys, hundreds, thousands of them, and organized, trained, and equipped, and they are a meaningful combat force right now. They're out there doing special reconnaissance. They're out there doing direct action. They're fighting. I don't know about this unit that was in Izzy and what they did and all that. I'm just saying that it appears that this International Legion has been transformed from what was pretty much a joke into a serious component of this new Ukrainian fighting force. What casualties they suffered, I don't know. But understand, this kind of force doesn't defeat a dug-in Russian enemy. These are surprise attacks. These are attacks designed to put the Russians off balance. But the real fighting was being done by Ukrainian armored brigades, mechanized brigades. And when I say real fighting, I think people need to understand that this is real war. This isn't a TV game. This isn't a movie, Hollywood movie. The courage it takes for the Ukrainians to carry out the assaults that they're doing right now is real, because the Russians are good and the Russians are killing them. And these guys are pressing attacks despite casualties. That's a kind of discipline that maybe we haven't seen before in the Ukrainian force. And then the courage of the Russians. Imagine to be this SWAT team, and you've got a couple battalions coming at you of heavy armored people, and you refuse to surrender, to retreat. You fight, you hold them off, you inflict heavy casualties, and then you withdraw in good order, which is exactly what happened. Two SWAT teams from Bashkiria and from Samara, played a very important role in holding a critical village and breaking up the Ukrainian attack to buy time for other Russian units to retreat in good order. So the courage on both sides cannot be diminished. If you're pro-Russian, yeah, go ahead, salute the Russians all you want, but don't denigrate the Ukrainians. If you're pro-Ukrainian, salute the Ukrainians all you want, but don't denigrate the Russians. There's a lot of courage going on, and this is real war. These are casualties like the world hasn't seen since the Second World War. I mean, this is real fighting.
Right. I mean, and then there's people like, I'm not for either side. I'm not against either, and I'm not for either. I'm against war. I'm against this type of war, and I'm really concerned about where we're going with this. I'm concerned with these foreign fighters that are there that are now, according to CNN, getting 3-year contracts that are being paid by the Ukrainian government, which is getting the money from us. So It's really the United States paying these foreign mercenaries or whoever it is that is being hired to, it is plausible deniability for the United States to say, well, we're not committing any NATO troops. We don't have any troops there, but it's a workaround. It is a workaround. And it's not like the Russians are dumb. I mean, they know that they're fighting a lot of people, probably foreign, or military guys that are now retired, or they've taken a pause and now they're going and fighting for Ukraine. I mean, they can't possibly be that dumb. So, I'm worried that this is going to escalate things, that this escalates and Russia says, look, we know who we're really fighting here. We're fighting Ukraine and we're fighting NATO, and we're going to now make you pay. And this could escalate. From my assessment, I don't see Russia ever backing down. I don't see how they could. And to them, it would be too humiliating. So if anything, if they got really backed into a corner, I worry that they would unleash something really severe. That's my concern. And of course, the concern being all of our money going over there, the concern that if we're backing Russia into a corner, they're not ever going to really truly go away. Even if they get out of Ukraine, they're still right there. So this is their neck of the woods. They're never going to fully retreat. I mean, they're going to be on their border forever. They need to get along. It's imperative they get along. for global security. And I just don't see where anybody on the West thinks this is actually going to lead, especially to anything good. I mean, I just don't see that happening. Where do you see this going? What's the end result here, especially now with this new offensive? I mean, a lot of people are rallying and they're saying, hey, Ukraine is going to do it. They're going to take back every single ounce of land, including Crimea. What do you think is really going to happen?
In the aftermath of the Battle of Kursk, one of the greatest tank battles fought in the history of the world, and one of the most decisive battles fought in all of World War II, where the Germans gathered together precious reserves and then launched a major attack against the Soviet forces in the vicinity of Kursk, which is not too far away from where the current fighting is taking place in Kharkiv. The Germans lost. They expended their reserves. They were never able to rebuild their reserves, and then the Russians seized the strategic initiative from that point on. A lot of historians say that at that point in time, the Soviet Union had won the war, but it still took many, many months, years, to actually defeat Nazi Germany. Right now, the Ukrainians have won a battle. That's it. I mean, people need to grow up. I'm tired of listening to amateurs talk about this who don't know anything about war, and I'm really tired of seeing retired generals get on CNN and MSNBC and talk about what happens as if this is the game changer. No, they won a battle. They won a battle where the Russians carried out a tactical withdrawal in good order, preserving their forces. And the Ukrainians have basically squandered their offensive capacity. It's going to take months to rebuild. Russia's not going to wait months. Russia is probably going to be transitioning away from what they call the special military operation, which is a term that has attached to it specific legal restrictions in terms of how military force can be used. There's talk that they may transition into what's called a counterterrorism operation, where they designate the Zelensky government as a terrorist organization because of its relationship with the Bandera ideology. Stepan Bandera, of course, is the national hero of Ukraine. He's a Polish citizen who, during the Second World War, allied himself with Nazi Germany, and afterwards is responsible for the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of Poles and Russians who he viewed to be in opposition to the notion of Ukrainian nationalism. He's the national hero. There's units right now who swear allegiance to him. And so Russia may transition to a counterterrorism operation, which will free their hands militarily. It's not general mobilization, but it will allow, legally permit the commitment of different kinds of forces and to do different kinds of actions that so far Russia has been legally constrained from doing. Russian law. People say, oh, the Russians don't believe in law. They believe in the rule of law. And once this happens, I think Ukraine is, the nature of this conflict is going to change, and there's nothing NATO or Ukraine can do to stop it. People who encourage the transfer of more weaponry to Ukraine are only condemning tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers to death and thousands of Russians to death as well. They're extending this war, lengthening it, but ultimately Russia is going to win this war. That's just an absolute guarantee. And the longer this war goes on, the more likely it is that Ukraine will cease to exist as a nation state. Don't get caught up, and I'm not saying this to you, I'm saying to the people listening, don't get caught up in the propaganda and the disinformation surrounding this Ukrainian offensive. Yes, Ukraine has won a battle. Yes, Ukraine has regained a lot of territory. But, at the end of the day, Germany launched a lot of attacks against the Soviet Union, won many battles, gained a lot of territory. But at the end of the day, Germany was defeated. And at the end of the day, Ukraine will be defeated. There's no military calculus. There's no military math that anybody can put forward that shows Ukraine being able to defeat Russia. As the Russian president said a little while ago, we haven't even begun. Our full capacity hasn't been expended. Ukraine right now is operating at 100%. Russia's operating at 20%. Russia has a lot more they can do against Ukraine, and Ukraine doesn't have much more they can do against Russia. And NATO knows that if they get directly involved, this is very risky because the Russians know what's going on. They know that this is NATO intelligence. They know that this is NATO command and control. The battle plan that we just saw unleashed wasn't drawn up by Ukrainian generals. It was drawn up by NATO generals. The logistics support plan is a NATO logistic support plan. The weaponry is NATO weaponry. Training is NATO training. And as you pointed out, it's not just the mercenaries that you see on the battlefield. There is hundreds, if not thousands, of contract military personnel, not from the United States, I don't believe, but from Great Britain and other nations that are working side by side with the Ukrainians to use this advanced weaponry and to exploit this intelligence. So this is a NATO army. That's exactly what's happening here. And Russia, they need to be careful, because at some point in time, if you do back Russia into a corner, Russia's going to call a spade and say, we're fighting NATO. Now, I don't believe Russia wants to expand this conflict to include any other nation other than Ukraine. But people need to understand that, a proxy war can only be called a proxy war so long as there's a real proxy doing the fighting for you. But the second you start to insert your own capabilities, it's no longer a proxy conflict, you're at war. And NATO is on the razor's edge of qualifying as being in direct conflict with Russia.
Yeah, I mean, I just really was hoping that this conflict would be over by now, that there would have been a negotiation for peace, and we're just not seeing any real promise of that. I think at this point, it looks like the Ukrainians have no interest in negotiating for peace. The Russians, not really sure, it's clear the Ukrainians don't want to negotiate at all.
Well, the Russians have shut the door. The Russians just shut the door. They said there will be no negotiations. That's what people don't understand. The Russians have said, they've never shifted. All objectives will be accomplished. That means demilitarization, denazification, and lately it's been the elimination of the Zelensky regime. Russia hasn't changed any of its objectives, and the Russian government officials have said there will be no negotiation with Ukraine. None.
So there's no negotiations on either side. I mean, Ukraine has said the only negotiation we have is you get out completely and out of Crimea, and that's our only negotiation, which is not a negotiation. So it sounds like neither side wants to negotiate. We're going to see how this plays out. Unfortunately, with thousands and thousands of lives lost, I mean, what is the point of all of this? It just makes me so frustrated with it, trying to understand, trying to wrap my mind around what people actually think is going to be accomplished with Ukraine. Even if they did run the Russians out and they won, what would happen for the average Ukrainian citizen? I don't think their life changes much, whether they're under Western corporations that control their government, like a banana republic, or they're under, Russian oligarchs. I mean, take your pick of which rich person runs your government. I just don't know if there's any real difference for the average Ukrainian. So I don't know why it's about resources. Clearly, there seems to be a war for resources. Russia wants to be in cahoots and control the Ukrainian resources. The West wants to be in cahoots and control the Ukrainian resources. And that seems to be what most wars about. Am I wrong about that?
Well, I mean, resources play a role. There's no doubt about it. But I would say that's secondary. This war is about two things. For Russia, this war is about creating the conditions for establishing a new European security framework. This is what Russia insisted on back in December of last year, before this special military operation began. They said, all we need NATO to do is stop expanding. Don't come into Ukraine and withdraw the NATO military technical means back to the 1997 boundaries. That doesn't mean that Poland and the Baltics stop being members of NATO. No, they can stay, Russia said. We just don't want major NATO military infrastructure in Poland or the Baltics. That's too close to our borders. We're not happy about this. And for the United States, frankly speaking, it's about getting rid of Vladimir Putin. I mean, the economic sanctions that we imposed were designed, and the Americans need to wake up to this. They keep saying, okay, you can be against Putin. You can say, I don't like Putin. I disagree with all that. But the sanctions weren't designed to hurt Putin. The sanctions were designed to destroy the Russian economy by destroying the Russian people. Right. It was a declaration of economic war against the Russian people. And, there was a lot of Russians that were against this war, but once they saw the sanctions and realized what was going on, they realized where the enemy was. And the enemy was in the West. These sanctions have failed, and that's the bigger picture here. They failed. They've backfired. And when you take a look at the war in Ukraine, you have to understand that for Russia right now, they're in the catbird seat. You see, it's September now. The weather's pretty good. It's a little warm. October's going to change. November's really going to change. And in December, people are going to start to freeze to death. And not just in Ukraine, but throughout all of Europe. And all this rah-rah enthusiasm for supporting Ukraine is going to diminish as people are fighting for survival. And this is Russia's major counterattack. And I think we're going to see a geopolitical shift in how the world views Ukraine as we enter into 2023. And many of these European politicians who supported these policies will have been removed by their governments collapsing in a sea of revolutionary unrest that's probably going to break out in many nations in Europe. So that's the bigger picture right now. It's more than just a military conflict in Ukraine. This is about geopolitical posturing. This is about economic warfare. This is about what the world's going to look like 5 years from now. Russia and China have united. They're against what they call American hegemony, this rules-based international order that Blinken and Biden are selling. They're against it, and they're winning. Most of the world supports Russia and China. That's what a lot of Americans don't understand. The vast majority of the world supports Russia and China, and they're supporting them in ways that are undermining us. The dollar may not be the supreme currency in the near future. So these are realities that have little to do with the battlefield and everything to do with, the posturing. And the frustrating aspect of it is it didn't have to be this way. Literally, all the United States had to do in December is formally say, Ukraine will never be a member of NATO. And had we said that, this war would not have happened.
Scott, well, thank you so much for your analysis on all of this. I really enjoy reading your stuff. Tell everybody where they can find more of your analysis.
I post everything on my Telegram page. I've been permanently banned from Twitter for daring challenge the official narrative. So everything goes on Telegram, and it's just simply Scott Ritter on Telegram.
Yeah. All right, Scott. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.